Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, we're going to jump right into a really tough one today. We're looking at a question that's, central for a lot of people of faith. How is it possible for a prophet, someone seen as God's spokesperson on earth, to make a massive mistake? A mistake that sticks around for more than 100 years.
So what we're really talking about here is a very painful and honestly a very complex chapter in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're talking about the former ban that prevented black members from holding the priesthood and from entering temples. So the big question is, how does an institution that believes it's led by prophets come to terms with a major policy that it now disavows as a mistake rooted in racism?
And, this wasn't just some brief oversight. It was a long, long time. The policy was officially put in place way back in 1852 by Brigham Young. And then for decades, you had church leaders kind of wrestling with it behind the scenes. But it took until 1978, that's 126 years, for a revelation to come and finally end it.
Okay, so this brings us to the most fundamental question, right? Where did this ban even come from in the first place? Was it a direct commandment from God, or was it something else?
Well, this is where it gets really, really interesting. The source material is crystal clear on this point. Unlike other major doctrines in the church, there was never a formal written revelation, a thus saith the Lord moment that started the ban. It was never canonized, never put into the scriptures.
So instead, what you had was a policy that really rested on the personal authority of Brigham Young. He'd make these strong declarations, like the one you see here, saying, "The Lord has told me so." But when you look at how he talked, it seems it was more an expression of his own deep personal conviction rather than him quoting a direct verbatim revelation from God.
And this comparison right here really tells the whole story. You've got the beginning of the ban in 1852, which was basically a policy heavily influenced by the societal racism of the time and based on one man's personal authority. Then you fast forward to the end, the reversal in 1978. That was a formal, canonized revelation described as a direct answer to prayer and published for the entire church to see. Two totally different things.
So for 126 years, this policy stayed put. And over time, even without a formal revelation to back it up, subsequent leaders started treating it as if it were established doctrine.
And you can imagine this created a real dilemma. You have leaders like President David O. McKay in the 50s and 60s who clearly struggled with it. He would say, look, this is a practice, it's not eternal doctrine, and it's going to change someday. But, and this is a big but, he felt his hands were tied. He didn't believe he could just undo it on his own. He felt he needed a revelation from God to overturn what a previous prophet had put in place.
And that brings us to the turning point, 1978. After what's described as years of intense prayer and struggle over this very issue, President Spencer W. Kimball and the other church leaders, they came forward and announced they'd received a powerful, unified spiritual witness. The message was clear. It was time to lift the ban.
Okay, but this just opens up an even bigger, tougher question, doesn't it? If prophets could be so wrong for so long on an issue this major, how can they be trusted? I mean, this gets right to the heart of the matter, the idea of prophetic fallibility. Now, what's fascinating is how the source material handles this. It basically says, hey, this problem, it isn't new. In fact, it's all over the scriptures. You just have to look. You've got Moses, who got angry and was barred from the promised land. You've got Peter, who at first refused to preach to non-Jews. You've got Jonah, literally running away from God's command. The point being made is that being a prophet has never, ever meant being infallible.
So how do you square that circle? How do you reconcile all this? Well, the document we're looking at presents a kind of framework for faith. And the core idea is to separate the person from the calling, to draw a line between their human fallibility and their divine role. Basically, you don't have to believe prophets are perfect to believe they're called by God. It really breaks down into 3 key steps. First, you make a clear distinction between the human leaders who are fallible and God who is perfect and just. Second, you have to recognize that God gives these leaders agency, and sometimes that means he permits human errors to exist until the time is right for correction. And third, and this is maybe the most important part, your ultimate faith isn't anchored in the infallibility of any person. It's anchored in Jesus Christ and in your own personal revelation.
And there is perhaps no better example of this framework in action than the story of Apostle Bruce R. McConkie. Now, for years, he was one of the church's leading theologians, and he had been one of the most prominent and vocal defenders of the priesthood ban, writing and speaking about it extensively.
And then, the revelation came in 1978. And just a short time later, he stood up in front of a large audience and did something pretty stunning. He told them,
forget everything that I have said that is contrary to the present revelation. And then he said, why? We spoke with a limited understanding. I mean, that's about as direct a public admission of prophetic error as you can get.
So when you put it all together, it points to a few key takeaways. The idea is that prophets are guides, not the source of salvation itself. God works through imperfect people. The Holy Ghost, your own personal confirmation, is really the ultimate test of truth. And this concept of continuing revelation isn't just about new stuff. It's the mechanism God uses to correct past misunderstandings. And there's this final point, that any eternal blessings someone might have been denied in this life, like temple ordinances, can be made available to them after they die through vicarious work.
And that leads to one final, really thought-provoking point the source makes about what faith even is. Think about it. If prophets were perfect, if everything they said was instantly true and never corrected, well, there wouldn't be much need for faith, would there? It would be too easy. There'd be no room for personal seeking or trust.
Which leaves us with this final question to chew on. Is it possible that this very space, this gap between divine authority on one hand and human error on the other, isn't actually a bug in the system, but maybe, just maybe, it's a feature? Could that be the very place where real personal faith is meant to exist and grow?